The study of cultural differences between nations has sometimes been criticized. Some scholars say that nations do not have homogeneous cultures. There are many nations consisting of different cultural, racial, ethnic groups. For example, in South Africa, there are blacks and whites, but even among the blacks, there are large differences because there are different ethnic groups. In the United States, there are white Americans, black Americans, people of Latin American origin, people of Asian origin. In many Asian countries, like Malaysia, there are Chinese and Indians and Malays, and there are very few countries, Japan is one of them, that are culturally homogeneous. And this is true, but when we analyze the constituents of these nations, different religions and different ethnic groups, we see that they're much more similar than we might expect. They form fairly homogeneous clusters, which means that, for example, people from different religions who live in the same nation have quite similar values and beliefs. For example, the Egyptian Muslims and the Egyptian Christians are much more similar culturally than the Egyptian Muslims and any other Muslims outside Egypt. So it is the national environment that creates the local culture, not so much the different religions that people follow. And some scholars say that differences between individuals can be much bigger than differences between nations, which is true, of course, but this doesn't mean that we should not study national differences. If we look inside human beings, we will see the differences between the cells that we are made of. For example, brain cells and heart cells and muscle cells are much more different than individuals. And that doesn't mean that we should study only cells and not individuals. Nations have clearly defined identities. People belong to different nations, they have different identities, and they're interested in their nations, and they would like to know why, as a whole, their nations differ from other nations. For example, people would like to know why some nations are rich and others are poor, why there is more corruption in some nations, less corruption, why some nations do better in studies of differences in education than other nations, why some nations have more crime than others. And this justifies the use of nations as units of analysis. As I said, Hofstede's model of national culture has triggered many controversies. It's been used very widely across the world, but many scholars felt that there were some issues with it because when they tried to use it for some specific purposes or when they tried to replicate some of its aspects, the results were not satisfactory. 5 years ago, I had an opportunity to do a study that focused on the Hofstede model. The idea was to repeat it and update it and find out what could be improved and what could not be improved, and in that case, it would need to be abandoned. The study was sponsored by the big British multinational company Mediacom. because they realized that culture and cultural differences have implications for international business. And Hofstede Insights, a consulting company that was also interested in this study and these cultural differences that we would find. And we interviewed about 53,000 respondents from 56 countries across the world. The samples were probabilistic, meaning that they reflected the national census quite well in most of these countries, so they're quite representative and trustworthy. The data collection was mostly online, and it was done in 2015 and 2016.